I've watched up until episode 10 and episode 5 of the original and new adaptations of Urusei Yatsura respectively, and I did this because both of these stretches of episodes end with the same dramatic beat as each other. I want to take a look at one of the overlapping jokes in this batch of episodes and break down why the new adaptation, more often than not, feels like a more watered down version of the original. My opinion of these two shows have changed greatly since the making of my first video on the subject, as now I see the original adaptation as the vastly superior version of the show, whereas the new one is, well, it's just kind of okay. Before getting into specifics, I want to make note of the fact that these two shows have such a different vibe to them, which is weird considering they're based on the same story. The original had this wonderfully mean-spirited cast of characters who consistently backstabbed and deeply wronged each other on a daily basis. They only really seem to interact with other people because of their own selfish motives, and a bit into watching this show, you start to realize every personality that makes up this town is just screwed up on a fundamental level. In the new adaptation, that feeling doesn't translate too well. Like, there are bits and pieces here and there, but most of the cynicism that defined the original style of comedy is just kind of gone now. Atsuru's friends are the best example of this. In the original, Atsuru's friends were this malicious group of people who wanted to see the main character suffer and fail at every turn. They were hilarious because of the absurd lengths that they go to try and ruin this guy's life and relationships. There are aspects of that in the new one, like in episode 2, where they're more or less portrayed in the same way as the original, but that's the only part of the show, at least in the part that I watched, where they act like that. Their role is actually rather supportive of Atsuru, like when they try to elect him as class president, or they try to hook him up with a girl for the sake of making someone else lose a bet. And yes, in these situations, they're acting out of their own self-interest, but making them back up the main character will inherently take away some of the malicious edge that made them so funny in the original, especially when compared to their plan in the original to publicly humiliate Atsuru in a way that he'd never be able to recover from, while simultaneously hoping that Lum would leave him so that they could get some alien pussy. And the times when they're not being supportive friends, albeit with some ulterior motives, they just act as onlookers whose only purpose is to comment on the really wacky state of the central relationship of the show, and occasionally accidentally says something that gets Atsuru into trouble. Some other examples of the new adaptation having less interesting and funny versions of their original counterpart are Atsuru's mother, who constantly craved attention and tried to cheat on her husband, with the first man who gave her that attention now being a bog-standard housewife and mother character. Atsuru's teacher in the original hated his job, probably hated his life, and constantly talked shit about the kids he taught, and in the new one, he's replaced by this guy who is just way too enthusiastic when you take a look at the average teacher's salary. Atsuru in general feels like a much cleaner character. His horniness doesn't tend to feel like an actual character trait and flaw of his, as much as it is something that's just forced onto his character in certain moments. If you wanted something analogous to the original versus new Urusei Yatsura situation, think classic versus modern Simpsons. From the mean-spirited cast of characters to the incredibly out-of-nowhere use of absurdist comedy to even some topics that are considered very sensitive nowadays, the old adaptation is a show that could never be made in modern times, and it's incredibly unique because of that. And look, if it was as simple as these characters just aren't as entertaining as the characters from the original, then I'd probably just let it go. But these mentally screwed up and morally bankrupt people that make up the original's cast also contribute to a very powerful and dramatic beat that happens in episode 10 and episode 5 of the old and new adaptations respectively. So almost entirely removing this aspect of the show in the new one was a really bad choice. Now, as I said in the beginning, there's one joke in particular that I want to talk about in this batch of episodes, and that's the joke where Atsuru runs away from home. Right from the start, the original adaptation starts the story with this scene of Atsuru running away from a spotlight and throwing in some shots that you'd probably see in a legitimate crime movie. This builds up intrigue in the audience very effectively and makes you wonder what's going on, and then you hear Lum's voice and you realize that nothing new is actually happening. I like the way that the mysterious feeling in the scene just kind of evaporates as Jeritan starts to chime in and talk shit about Atsuru. It's great. I love this opening scene a lot because it establishes the plot of this part of the episode well and in a way that's really refreshing and doesn't feel like the characters are just going through the motions and repeating their dynamic over and over again. The original adaptation manages to constantly find ways to keep things fresh while never missing out on the main appeal of the show. Look at this shot in particular. Everything looks all enigmatic with this blinding light in the background, the way Atsuru's body is hunched over as he hides from Lum and Shinobu. Even the music in the background is trying to make some kind of suspenseful atmosphere, but all of that is ruined by the way Shinobu and Lum just devolve into this barbaric fit of rage as they start fighting over the protagonist. The framing of the scene is totally at odds with what's actually happening, and I found just how refined the filmmaking and shot composition here is to be funny when combined with the crude behavior of the characters in the scene. It gives the story beat so much more flavor and personality compared to how the new adaptation handles the same beat. The new adaptation's way of establishing the same thing is just really bland. Lum is getting all lovey-dovey with Atsuru in class, and Shinobu beats the shit out of him in a scene that you could find in literally any comedy anime ever. Then Lum shocks Atsuru and he yells about how bad his life is getting now. Cool. Something about the new adaptation that I noticed is that the characters start to get really annoying really fast. Whereas the original adaptation's jokes felt more layered and creative, this show just seems to think that the characters constantly yell yelling at each other is very funny. After Atsuru runs away from home, you can see him sitting in a ramen shop in his disguise, and even something as small as how Atsuru eats his food here is really telling of the differences between these two shows. Look at how he lifts his mask up to start eating. There's nothing to really make note of here, he's just eating, and to be fair to the new adaptation, they don't need to make this into a side-splitting joke, but in the original he has this mask with a zipper, so in that version he unzips his mask to start eating, which is such a stupid fucking invention that nobody in their right minds would ever try to imitate, because the whole point of that zipper is rendered entirely pointless by common fucking sense. It's like one of those dumb life hacks that are way too specific to be applicable to any realistic scenario at all. Oh my god, why? I don't know when this no doubt incredible scientific breakthrough was first invented, but I really hope it wasn't before they made the first adaptation of Urusei Yatsura, because that would be really funny. The original anime seems to love these little surreal jokes that don't seem like that big of a deal, but they're details that say so much about the creator's love for this world and how they want to inject a silly element into every aspect of the show. And just like the new show, the original didn't need to do this, but they did, and I think that's really important to make note of. But that's not the worst thing about this scene in the new adaptation. The worst thing about it is how it sets up the main joke and punchline. In the original, while he's eating, he sees his family being featured on a missing person news channel or whatever, so he starts to panic because he now knows that they're looking for him. But he reassures himself that he's safe because he's wearing a disguise, only for him to be interrupted by a picture of him exactly as he looks now being shown on TV, and this joke is absent from the new adaptation. Actually, it's not absent, I just didn't know that it was even supposed to be a joke in the first place. The problem with this joke in the new adaptation is they cut out Atsuru reassuring himself because he has a disguise on. They only keep him freaking out about all of the people expressing concerns for him on TV. It may seem small, but cutting out this one line makes all the difference when setting up a joke. And when you see this photo on the screen, part of you can probably recognize that the show is trying to make you laugh, but it doesn't do a good job of giving you enough information to genuinely feel that the situation is funny. Maybe some people will call me a hypocrite because I praise some jokes in the original for having no build-up and because of how out of nowhere it is the joke manages to work. But there are a lot of different types of jokes, and those different types of jokes require different types of setup. Here it just feels like something's missing, and that's not good. I could keep going, but I actually want to stop there. I feel like I've compared enough between these two shows and I've made my point. The new show's sense of humor is much more bland and generic. I find it funny that the only times I actually laughed at this show were a result of some of the interesting voice acting in some scenes and nothing else. I would talk about some of its other episodes, but I feel like I would just be saying the same thing over and over again. So instead of comedy, I'm gonna take a look at how this show handles more serious and dramatic moments. More specifically, we're going to talk about the Christmas episode from the original show and its counterpart from the new one. First, let's get the surface level differences out of the way. The original adaptation gives the storyline a whole episode as opposed to the half episode it got in the new adaptation, and in the original adaptation it's Christmas season, but in the new one it's just a regular ass day. Neither of these differences matter that much. They do contribute to minor problems in the new adaptation, but none of the major failings of the new show stem from these specific differences in my opinion. And the problem isn't that Atsuru doesn't spend enough time with Lum to make this moment between the two of them feel earned. Saying that that's the only reason why the original works and the new one doesn't honestly just kind of undermines a lot of the actually amazing direction in this episode. I particularly like the sequence of Lum walking through the mall alone with this holly jolly Christmas theme playing in the background while she's busy being depressed. What's interesting is that up until this point, the show never focused on the fact that Lum is an alien. They never went into what it feels like for her to be away from home so often and spend so much time on this planet she doesn't know that well. But here they actually focus on it quite a bit. They show you how differently she dresses, she's walking in the opposite direction of all of these people, and then they go full on racist and make everyone else blue with this hazy effect. What she feels is clear. She feels isolated, she feels lonely, but the show never emphasized that aspect of her character before because she was always with Atsuru, and because of Atsuru, she always felt at home. This one scene does more to establish just how much Atsuru means to Lum than anything in the new adaptation does. And the scene of her sitting on the clock when deciding to go back and help Atsuru is also really great. I love the way they use the clock to show her changing her mind and coming to the realization that even though Atsuru deserves what's about to happen to him, she still loves him enough to help him. This is also just a really atmospheric moment. I love the camera pan over the city and seeing Lum just sit there as the bell chimes in the background. Some really cinematic shit going on here. This episode is just filled with great shots and imagery. It's really awesome. Something that surprised surprised me about this episode is the way they made Atsuru realize that he was in love with Lum, because up until this point he's been treating her like shit, so I was pleasantly surprised by how they were able to make him change his view of her in a way that didn't feel forced. As I mentioned before, Atsuru's friends were trying to publicly humiliate and beat the shit out of this guy, and as a side note, I really loved Atsuru's friends in this episode since they were the main source of comedy here. The scenes of them recruiting people for their diabolical plan were fucking hilarious, and this guy's laugh actually made me laugh way more than I'd like to admit. I also love just how absurd the lengths they go to ruin this one guy's life are, and how pretty much everybody in the town, including a reporter who's going to photograph this moment and have it seen by the entire world, seems to support them because of how many problems Atsuru has caused. The extremity of this situation works because the show is highlighting just how ridiculous this all is, but it also works as a way of completely shifting the way Atsuru sees Lum now. And that brings me to the scene of them together at the end. It was really understated and said something that I haven't really seen in a lot of anime. Like, in this scene, Atsuru doesn't understand the fact that he's in love with Lum, but he does start to unconsciously feel that way towards her, which is shown through the way he instinctively grabs her hand as she's about to fly away. When he makes note of how pretty she is, that's not him being horny or looking at her physical appearance, it's him recognizing that there's something different about her compared to other women, or maybe even other people in general. He doesn't know what that is yet, but he knows that it's there. Part of the reason why I thought it was incredibly important for all of the characters to be these incredibly malicious assholes was that it made Lum feel completely different as a result. She just feels a lot more innocent, and unlike the rest of the cast, she doesn't try to take advantage of other people for her own personal gain. All of her actions feel like a result of her genuine love for Atsuru, and even when she doesn't like someone very much, there's something so endearingly sincere about the way she expresses herself around them. Even though from Atsuru's perspective, Lum is nothing but trouble, from ours, she's really the most pure character in this show. After everything he did to her in this episode, after how badly he treated her, Lum didn't have any reason to save Atsuru from that absolute shitstorm, but she did, and that's something that I genuinely feel no other character in this show would do. And if you look at the scene in the new adaptation, you can see the same general idea. Like, all of these elements from the original scene are still there, but they don't feel the same, because in this version, the only characters who are shown to be somewhat fucked up are the main characters, which includes Lum. Something about the way they draw her face and the way she acts in these scenarios makes her seem so much more conniving and similar to someone like Shinobu. The best way I could put it is, she feels like the same character as Shinobu, just reskinned and assigned a different love interest. Another reason why I don't think the scene works as well is because Atsuru wasn't put in a position where he really needs to be grateful towards Lum. Instead of having pretty much everybody in the world trying to sabotage Atsuru's life, Atsuru's friends are instead trying to humiliate this guy, I don't remember his fucking name, which in this episode they do lie to Atsuru and get his hopes up for something that won't happen, but it's not like they're deliberately trying to hurt him. In fact, they go out of their way to make Atsuru seem cool because they also benefit from doing something like that. On paper, I guess it makes sense that Atsuru would be grateful to Lum for rescuing him in his hour of need, but from our perspective, nothing of any consequence would have happened if she didn't, so this doesn't do a good job of convincing me that Atsuru would look at Lum in a new light after this. I also don't like the way Atsuru blushes here, or the musical choice in the background. Like, the scene is fine, but it feels like something you would just see in any kind of romance. In comparison, Atsuru's expression in the original is a lot more restrained. They're not shoving this in your face, they just show you these characters silently enjoying each other's company. Like, there's this one moment where Lum gives Atsuru the scarf she was knitting for him, and he just quietly looks at it wrapped around him. And you can tell he's kind of taken aback by the sudden gift, and it's just really nice. They're a cute couple. Also, once the scene starts using music, they don't put in this generic song. They play this beautiful Christmas hymn, and they linger on the shot of the two of them walking, and it's honestly just really beautiful. Anyways, hopefully I made my point here. Like, I don't think the new show is bad. I just think it's a lot less interesting and fun to watch than the original in terms of both comedy and drama. If you happen to be a fan of the new version, I'm sorry, but I hope you still liked the scene comparisons. That's all, and I'll be going now.